I first started playing Fire Emblem when Fire Emblem 7 came out in America in 2003. Around the same time, I was playing another Nintendo strategy game, Advance Wars. I consider this a pivotal moment in my gaming lifetime, as this is when Fire Emblem took up permanent residence in my brain rent-free. But sometimes I think about how, given slightly different circumstances, it could have been Advance Wars instead. The big difference maker for me was supports. I loved the gameplay in both Advance Wars and Fire Emblem, but Fire Emblem had these little conversations between units called support conversations that had me totally falling in love with the cast. It was this amazing second layer on top of the gameplay that led to me starting new runs to unlock more supports, discussing my favorite characters with friends, and checking out web forums to see what everyone else thought about the characters I liked. And even better, supports affected gameplay too. As your favorite characters became better friends, they fought better near each other. This brought a real power of friendship vibe to a game I already loved and enjoyed. Since then, supports have become an even bigger part of Fire Emblem, with recent games including tons of supports and putting more of a focus not only on developing characters, but also allowing players to pair units off romantically, sometimes resulting in child units that come with their own unique gameplay and more support conversations. As you may have noticed, I mostly talk about gameplay and the history of Fire Emblem on this channel. So I'll be giving you the history on supports, but since supports touch on so much more than just mechanics and gameplay, I decided I needed to reach out to someone that knows a bit more about game writing than I do. So I did some research and found out that mermaids are geniuses when it comes to romance and writing. The only problem is I can't swim. Fortunately, I happen to know a mermaid who moved up to the surface a few years ago. AquaSyreni is a super cool streamer that specializes in games with romance and relationship building mechanics, and she's going to help me explain why supports and romance are so important to Fire Emblem.
Hello everyone, my name's AquaSyreni. I'm a mermaid princess who traded her brain cells for legs, and I'm here to help talk about what I think makes supports interesting from a writing standpoint, when they do and don't work, and how I think the topic of romance itself can support a story. My very first Fire Emblem was Awakening. I knew about the series, especially characters like Marth and Ike and Roy from their appearances in Smash Bros., but it was just one of those series I never got a copy of growing up. By the time the DS came out, though, I had some of my own spending money and was no longer, stuck getting games based on the titles my parents recognized or what I could talk them into getting me. At the time I was, and now I still am, pretty into dating sims, or any games with relationship building mechanics, like Persona, Harvest Moon, and BioWare's RPGs. While the self-insert nature of a lot of those dating sims was definitely fun, I was always kind of in love with love, especially in fiction, and so I gravitated toward any media that had a good romance in it. So, when a friend at the time messaged me saying I should really play this new Fire Emblem game on the DS, they specifically mentioned the fact that you can romantically pair up almost any characters in the cast that you wanted to. This idea exploded my little brain, and even without being told anything beyond that, I pretty much immediately reserved a copy from my local game store. Picking up the game for real, I found myself loving many other aspects of it. It was my very first tactical RPG, and I loved it. I adored the characters, world, story, and music too. But I really did get very into experimenting with supports. I wasn't deterred by the fact that I accidentally married Crom instead of Henry during my first playthrough. Over the next few months, I played and replayed Awakening many times, just wanting to see as many possible combinations as I could. It's something that I've continued enjoying as I've played more and more of the series. I even found it really funny when Three Houses was announced, because I instantly recognized that game's art style. I'd known the lead artist and character designer, Chinatsu Kurohana, as the lead artist for the popular dating sim and anime series Utano Prince Sama. The Three Houses staff stated that they felt she was the best choice to illustrate the glamorous, aristocratic society portrayed in the game, but I still think it's very cute that they recruited someone with plenty of experience designing characters meant to be appealing for romance-focused storytelling, considering how popular that aspect of Fire Emblem has become, especially since Awakening's release.
So supports are really important to both of us, and to me they feel like a defining feature of the series, but we actually didn't have supports as we know them today until the 6th game in the franchise. And even after that, things changed a bit from game to game. In the first Fire Emblem game, players were treated to a massive cast of characters. most of whom had only 2 or 3 lines in the entire game. Marth and his closest allies took center stage in the story, and most other units had nothing to say after recruitment. You could still grow attached to units through their portrait or in-game performance, but characterization was limited. Characters in Fire Emblem 1 were designed to be disposable and replaced by later recruitments if they died. This was pretty much the status quo for the first 3 Fire Emblem games, though as we moved to the SNES for Fire Emblem 3, more characters did get the occasional extra line of dialogue.
Fire Emblem, by nature, needs a large cast. You're controlling an army, after all. But it can be hard to make all those characters feel equally developed without distracting from the main character's arcs and the overall story. If each game's main story had to stop to make sure you could really get to know every single unit, it would cause some pretty severe story bloating, and would make the pacing feel incredibly uneven. Supports, which are optional but reward you with stat buffs for viewing them, are one of the series' best-known answers to that problem. Supports can develop as both romantic and platonic relationships. For the sake of this video, I'm going to be focusing on romantic supports and romance and storytelling, but let it be said I enjoy a good platonic or familial support too, and they can be just as important to developing characters or a world as romantic ones can be.
We got our first taste of pairing units up and playing matchmaker in Fire Emblem 4 in the form of its romance and events system. Events were essentially small conversations or monologues that occurred when you met certain conditions, and these could range from obvious ones like placing units next to each other, to very hidden ones like moving Arden onto a specific out-of-the-way space in Chapter 2, but only if he doesn't already have a wife. Lots of the events in Fire Emblem 4 establish or build on character relationships. For example, Combat Veteran Quan has multiple events that involve training a younger knight, Finn. What's so cool about these events is that in addition to telling us more about Finn and Quan, these events also provide some tangible gameplay benefits. Their first event provides Finn with some extra free points of stats, and one of their later events involves Quan gifting Finn a Brave Lance. Fire Emblem 4 also introduced the series' first romance system. Unlike today, where units romance each other at the end of their support conversations, Fire Emblem 4 characters simply become lovers after spending enough time next to each other in battle. There are a lot of events that can expedite this process and build the relationship between 2 possible lovers, but it's entirely possible to marry 2 units without even realizing you did it just by leaving them next to each other too often, which is kind of funny. Parents in this game pass down skills and items to their children in Part 2, so you get to experience the results of your pairings in a pretty unique way that the series didn't follow up on until Awakening over a decade later. Over the course of the game, events in Fire Emblem 4 ensure that nearly every character gets at least 1 or 2 chances to have a conversation and show off their personality. I think that's part of the reason you'll often hear people talking about which characters they love from Fire Emblem 4, but you don't hear about this as much for games that came before Fire Emblem 4, with the exception of people that really love one of the lords or one of the few characters that got a lot of screen time. In the next game in the series, Fire Emblem Thracia 776, the first support system was introduced. It's pretty different than what we know supports as today, though. There are no support conversations in Fire Emblem 5, instead units have hidden support bonuses with each other, which buff their performance when they fight near each other. An interesting quirk of this game is that supports can be one way. For example, Tanya gets a support bonus from fighting near her father, Dagdar, but he doesn't get any bonus from fighting near her. Finally, in Fire Emblem 6, we got the support conversations that we know and love today. Units have a variety of support partners, and they have to build up their relationships with each one by battling near them, eventually unlocking conversations that allow us to peer into their relationship as it grows. Units could have up to 3 conversations with each support partner and a total of 5 across all of their support partners. So you could have 5 C supports with 5 different partners, or 1 A support and a B support, or whatever combination you want as long as it adds up to 5 conversations. Characters usually have a handful of units they can support, and you generally can't get them all in a single playthrough, so you have to pick and choose which ones are most important to you or play the game multiple times. Support conversations in Fire Emblem 6 ensure that every character has a chance to shine, even if they have a minimal role in the story or none at all. This means that when a character's introduction intrigues you, you always have the opportunity to hear more from them. This also means that first impressions become really important, as players will naturally use and unlock supports more for characters that are likable or powerful as soon as they join the team. The support framework we got in Fire Emblem 6 became the framework for the modern support conversations that we've had today, and some version of it has appeared in almost every entry since then.
Supports often provide a chance to see characters in environments less high stakes than war and political or fantasy intrigue, and to see two characters interact with one another who would otherwise not get any screen time together. Building close bonds through supports in your army can also enhance gameplay and tension. Caring more about your army and their relationships because you've spent time with them and seen them interact during lower stakes will make a map even more tense because, hey, if that unit dies here, not only did you lose an asset to your army, the husband of the character you really like just died, and you don't want to see that happen to them because of your mistakes, do you? I think there are some misconceptions of romance and storytelling as unnecessary and a bother that gets in the way of more interesting plot elements. And don't get me wrong, a lot of the time that is true. Stories that struggle to thoughtfully implement romance may tend to simply pair up male and female leads because, well, that's how they think it's supposed to end up. Like checking off a box of things to put in a story, rather than giving it thought or enough development on how that romance reflects or enhances characterization, chemistry, and themes. Romance can convey a lot about a character's wants and needs. What they look for in a partner can often parallel what they want out of life, or the traits and viewpoints they find important that might be reflected in the rest of the plot and themes of a story. And when well done, this can serve to enhance and reinforce what a writer wants you to get out of a game. To use an example, it says very different things about who you are if you'd rather date your childhood best friend you've known forever who has a very similar personality to you, or someone you met more recently who challenges your worldview. It's a tool for characterization that quietly says a lot when used effectively, and you're given the chance to understand how these feelings develop. Chemistry between characters, essentially the belief that, yes, they can and would be attracted to one another, that what they feel is genuinely love for one another, is probably the hardest thing to nail in writing romance, despite arguably being the most important. There's no real formula or way to do it, because that's not how feelings work, but a lack of it is extremely noticeable. Taste also plays a large role. Different people relate to or like to see different character dynamics in romance. A storyline or dynamic one person loves might be something another person hates to see. This is one reason why supports that allow you to pair almost any characters together can be nice. The player gets to guarantee that they pair up characters who appeal to their personal tastes, rather than hoping they'll enjoy whatever the canon dynamic might be. Supports can also help make each playthrough feel unique. As I've mentioned before, I've had a lot of fun replaying Awakening to see how different pairings change the feel of the story, and how I move my units around even on maps I've played many times before. It definitely made my replays feel fresher, and provided extra incentive to play around with what I was doing, since I'd been trying to keep very different characters close to each other each time. On the other hand, stories that instead choose to write focused, canon pairings have the advantage of being able to weave them more into the main story. Shadows of Valentia's emotional crux and drama has a lot to do with Alm and Celica's feelings for one another, which would not be doable if the plot had to account for them being able to fall in love with other people you did the supports for.
In contrast to Shadow of Valentia's fewer romance options, Fire Emblem Awakening brought us the modern support system, and with it, tons of romance options. Characters could support as many characters as the player wanted, and most characters had a ton of support options to choose from. Plus, many characters of opposite genders could reach the new S-rank support, in which they would confess their love and eventually have children that you could use in battle later in the game. I firmly believe that the changes Awakening made to supports and romance are a huge part of what kickstarted the Fire Emblem franchise to the popularity it has today. People loved playing Matchmaker with their units in Awakening, and people that were more into the gameplay often still enjoyed optimizing their pairings to get the best child units. To this day, if you talk to someone about Awakening, it's pretty likely that one of the first things they'll ask you is, who did you romance? I romanced Sully for the first time, for what it's worth. This support system had major implications for the future of the franchise. Fates doubled down and kept romance in child units, though it made a lot less sense to have child units in Fates since time travel wasn't part of the plot. Instead, there were very convenient portals where you could throw a baby and then they'd pop out as a combat-ready unit a few moments later. Sorta odd. The series has continued to have romance as a focus for its avatars, such as in Three Houses or Engage. However, in these games, S supports only exist for Alir and Byleth, and other units either get paired endings in 3 houses or simply don't romance each other in Engage.
Returning to Awakening, it provides a good example of how romantic supports can sometimes make writing a little stilted in some ways to account for them. An extremely important part of Awakening's story is the plot beat that Chrom needs to get married and have a child. At a certain point in the game, even if you haven't viewed Chrom's S-rank support with any of the women he can marry, the game will stop in its tracks to let Chrom and whoever he has the highest affection with proclaim their love for one another so that they can be married in the time skip that comes in the next scene. A lot of people, like me, will end up accidentally forcibly marrying Chrom on their first playthrough if they play as female Robin, simply because they're 2 characters who are required on every map, so you have a really high chance of them standing next to each other the most, even if you're not particularly intending to do that. This also leads to kind of hilarious methods of guaranteeing he matches up with Olivia, where she's introduced much later than Chrom's other potential brides. So if you want her to marry him, you're going to spend that last map chasing Chrom around a corner of the battlefield and making her dance for him a ridiculous amount of times to try and force them to fall in love before you let the map end. If you somehow manage to keep Chrom totally celibate, don't let him anywhere near a woman who could possibly marry him. He'll end up married to some random villager NPC, because, well, he has to be married and a father for the game's plot to progress. I think this outcome is hilarious, because by all rights, Chrom's wife really should be a fairly major character in the latter half of the game, but the writers have to account for the fact that this random woman the player has no attachment to could fulfill that role. You don't run into any of those issues or slight writing awkwardness if there are canon romantic couples, though. And if you like Alm and Celica as a pairing, for example, and care about their romance, this means you get a story that treats you to a lot of moments between them that can really help heighten your emotional investment in the overall story. The downside to this is, if you don't like Alm and Celica as a couple, or aren't particularly invested in them, this runs the risk that the game's entire story and those key emotional scenes between the 2 of them could fall flat for you instead. I've heard a lot of people who've played Shadows of Valentia bring up how much they care about Alm and Celica's relationship as a big part in how much they liked the story, so it really can make a significant difference. There really is no correct way to do romance when choosing between canon pairings and romantic supports, though. What makes for good romance is really subjective, so one person's trash might be another's treasure, and even within Fire Emblem's system, there are a lot of examples of both good and bad supports. My personal favorite example of a support would be Cyril and Lysithea from 3 Houses. I've heard that a lot of people dislike Cyril because they feel like he fixates on and talks about Rhea too much, but hey, here's the support where she isn't mentioned by him even once. When it comes to his and Lysithea's actual dynamic in the support, I like the fact that these are 2 characters who try super hard to be independent and capable. So at first the conflict seems to be about that, with Cyril refusing Lysithea's offers to help him with chores, something she's clearly offering as an extension of the fact that she wants anyone and everyone to see her as grown up and capable. As the supports progress, this turns into Cyril being able to open up to Lysithea about something he isn't able to do, his inability to read. And rather than jumping on the opportunity to teach him everything, she treats him and his intelligence with respect, and encourages the idea that he can learn himself, and has always been able to if he believes he can, rather than just hand-holding him through it. Despite her being my favorite character in 3 Houses, I also don't mind that Lysithea dies young in this support's ending, even though she is cured and manages to live a long life in others. I'm a sucker for stories about how it's the quality of time you spend with someone, not the quantity that matters, and their ending makes it very clear that they were happy until the end. It's one of those scenarios where personal taste can add a lot to enjoyment. Also, I'm Bappy too is just the most adorable thing, and I loved it. If I were to pick a support that I find, well, not bad, but disappointing, it would be Chrom and female Robin in Awakening. Chrom and Robin are, in a way, nice because their friendship gets a lot of time and development in the main story. Their relationship, whether romantic or platonic, is a big deal, so they aren't quite as in need of development as other relationships might be. But all the same, I just wasn't that into where they took the support. A good chunk of the support is instigated by Chrom, who, as a prince, is used to the standards of aristocracy, and doesn't really think of Robin as a lady. And she's mildly upset by this. From there, The two of them both walk in on one another naked, which embarrasses them before they reconcile. I guess them seeing each other this way is meant to make them more aware of one another being of different sexes, but I'm gonna be real. Even in the best case scenario, bad anime has already left me extremely tired and uninterested in the trope of accidentally walking in on your love interest while they're undressed. They could have done more interesting things with exploring what these two do together during their downtime. The positives I can point to here are that I'm glad Chrom and Robin handle seeing each other this way pretty realistically and maturely. They do get embarrassed, but there's no over-the-top yelling at one another or Robin hitting Chrom and calling him a pervert like you'd see in the animes that soured me on this trope. I appreciate them being able to calm down and just say, yeah, this was awkward, but it was just an accident, so it's fine.
One of my favorite things about Fire Emblem supports is that they can break up heavy moments in the story and add some levity. Lots of romances in Fire Emblem are touching or sweet, but some of my favorites lean more into humor. One of my favorites is Kent and Fiora's support in Fire Emblem The Blazing Sword. Kent and Fiora are both proper knights and can sometimes be sticks in the mud. Their support kicks off with a simple introduction, and Kent mentions that Fiora's sister, Florina, has said that the pair are very similar to each other. Nothing too exciting so far, but the B support is where things really start to become amusing. Kent and Fiora discuss how upset they are that everyone else in the army is incredibly horny and distracted from their work. Kent and Fiora are so concerned about the moral failings of their compatriots that they decide to recommend that Lyn institute an order limiting the interactions between soldiers of different genders. At the end of this conversation, Fiora agrees to meet Kent at his tent so they can use their morally pure minds to come up with the details of the order that they discussed. The A support starts right after their meeting in the tent, and, well, let's just watch the end of the B support and the beginning of the A support. It's a perfect punchline, and after having a good laugh at the couple, I was happy to see them get together permanently after the war. Supports like these are great because Fire Emblem can be really melodramatic sometimes. In those moments where the plot is at its darkest, a cute or funny support can really brighten the mood and repair my emotional state enough to take on the next chapter. We've focused a lot on romance in this video, but there are also all sorts of other relationships that are explored in Fire Emblem supports as well. Supports cover all sorts of relationships, like friendships, begrudged allies, and even enemies at times. One of my favorite types of relationships explored in Fire Emblem games, though, are parent-child relationships. My favorite example of this is in Fire Emblem Fates between Laszlo and Celil. The C support between this pair is basically just Celil and Laszlo gassing each other up. Laszlo praises Celil for her ability to get women to join her for tea, while she compliments Laszlo for his sick dance moves. The conflict of this support starts to unveil itself towards the end, when Celil wants to learn how to fight like her father, while her father is afraid of what might happen to her if she joins him on the front lines. He eventually relents without too much prodding and agrees to teach her to fight, after a quick break for a cup of tea. The B support for this pair begins with Celil having been injured recklessly defending Laszlo from an attack. Laszlo demands that she never put herself in danger like that, and Celil retorts that she refuses to lose him again, having spent most of her life alone in the Deep Realms. The two bond over their fear of losing each other and promise not to leave each other's sides ever again. Finally, the A support involves Laszlo explaining that at some point Celil is going to have to help him decide whether or not he should leave the world of Fire Emblem Fates and return to the world he came from. It ends with them reaffirming their promise to never separate, and with each of them telling the other that they'll love them forever. Although I'm not huge on these characters in the rest of Fire Emblem Fates' script, I adore this support. Many of the parent-child relationships in Fates are strained, and lots of parent and LGBT-child relationships are strained in media in general. While I understand why this is, and many of those depictions are valid and good as well, the Laszlo and Celil support really resonated with me, both as a person that loves my parents a lot and as a person who is bisexual. I loved that the support showed two people working through their abandonment issues together, and I loved that even when there was tension, both Salil and her father unquestionably supported each other. Salil loves who her dad is, and Laszlo loves who his daughter is. And that's what we all want, right? So whether you like shipping your characters, learning more about your favorite soldiers, seeing how two enemies become friends, or all of the above, Fire Emblem's support system has something for you. Supports are the emotional glue that makes Fire Emblem more than just chess with anime characters. It's the reason I fell in love with almost every cast of characters in the series, and really, it's a huge part of why I love the series in general. If you made it to the end, thanks for listening to us gush about supports. I'm always interested to see what supports resonate most with people, so I'd love to hear what your favorite support is and why in the comments. Also, a big thank you to Aqua for joining me in this video. Aqua is a really great streamer, and you can find her on YouTube or on Twitch at twitch.tv/AquaSyreni. If you want to see more of us chatting about Fire Emblem, I'll actually be on her stream on Saturday at 3 o'clock CST, and we'll be ranking all of the Fire Emblem characters from Awakening to Three Houses based on how much we like them. It's going to be a good time, and I hope we'll see you there. I also made a Discord this week, and there's a link to that in the description, so if you want to chat with me and some of the other people that like the videos about Fire Emblem, we'd love for you to check it out. And lastly, if you liked this video and you want to see more like it, consider hitting the like and subscribe button and have yourself an awesome week.